Chapter 17. U.S. Army. In the dim light of morning, First Sergeant Thomas scanned the area around what used to be the Rocktown Public School, hoping she could find just the right opportunity to attack. Covered by her camouflage poncho, she peered through the binoculars. It seemed as if Jonathan was already expecting company, and not the welcome type. Blue helmets moved from one area of the roof to the next. All around the grounds of the facility they seemed to walk. Around the buildings like children playing Follow the Leader. "Any sign of the woman, First Sergeant?" a sergeant asked as he peered through the scope of his rifle. With disgust in her voice, Thomas replied, "Not a damn thing, and I don't think we're going to get much intel from here. Have you at least spotted an avenue of approach? It looks like we're going to be attacking blind, and I want to be in close before the firing begins." Directing his attention from his scope to her, he could see the concern on her face, concern that was well-deserved when it came to attacking a hardened facility with such little information. "The only area I have seen is the stream that runs along the backside of the buildings, but since this rain started, it has turned into a little river." Pulling the binoculars back up, Thomas directed them to the stream where she could see the water rushing down, as if it were just right for a Colorado whitewater rafting trip. Though the light was dim, something caught her eye downstream. "Sergeant, look down the stream just where it enters the woodline. What do you see?" Slowly turning in the direction she had indicated, Sergeant Weiser settled once again behind the rifle scope and began to scan the area. After a few minutes had passed, he replied, "Nothing, First Sergeant. Wait, I see it. Damn, they have personnel in the creek bed." "Well, Weiser, we will just have to deal with them. Take whoever you need and quietly subdue them. The element of surprise is all we have, and I don't want to lose it." Within a few minutes, Weiser had 5 heavily armed men following him as they moved using the empty houses around them as cover. Quickly, he led the men in a large arching path to their objective, docking behind garden sheds, plastic toy houses, and even dog houses that were obviously built much too big for the dogs. It did not take long at the speed they were moving before entering the wood line that ran perpendicular to the stream, which was located at the bottom of the hill where he and his men stood. From just inside the woods, he turned back to ensure all his men had made it and were ready for the next stage. The distance down to the creek was not that far, and Weiser wasn't taking any chances on his men walking into an ambush. Slowly, they began their walk down the hill, using trees and brush of the forest to cover their advance. With every step, each man watched not only where he figured the soldiers in the creek were, but also for others in the woods. At times like these, each man could feel all senses heighten and the primal instinct to fight rather than run taking hold of him. From that point, each relied on how well he paid attention in training to get him through, this being the point where, if he had been the class clown, he would most likely be a dead one. Seeing a head bob up and back down from the deeply eroded stream, not far outside the wood line, Weiser was happy with his position. Approaching from above and behind the enemy was always the preferred position to be in when attacking. Though confident in his abilities and training, Weiser could feel anxiety boiling up within as the moment to attack neared. This would be his first combat mission, and he never believed that it would be taking place on U.S. soil. Nevertheless, it was time, and as he looked back to the men following him to give the order to attack, every muscle in his body froze in fear. Not fear of giving the order, but fear for the 5 men behind him as he watched them get thrown around like ragdolls. Weiser watched as one of the 2 men who had taken out all 5 of his in a matter of seconds released the one he held around the neck. As the soldier's body fell to the forest floor, he watched as the large man swiftly moved in his direction, and the feeling of helplessness overrode his primal instincts and training altogether. With the man towering above him where he had crouched behind a tree to prepare for the attack, Weiser could feel the fight in him take over again as he brought his weapon up to avenge his men. After 2 swift kicks, he felt his rifle leave his hands, and a burning sensation spread out across the side of his face. Slowly he looked up to his attacker, and even in the dim light of the forest, Weiser's eyes were drawn to his name tag that read, Karnik. "You think we should leave this one alive or kill him?" Weiser heard Karnik ask the man walking up behind him in almost a laughing tone. Recognizing the name Karnik from the briefing Thomas had given them on the United Constitutional Militia, Weiser wanted to scream out, "I am not with those inside the facility." But he knew there was no way to prove it, and he really didn't want another kick to the head. Watching the second man come into sight as he stopped alongside Karnik, he felt there might be some hope of getting out of this alive. "You're Master Sergeant Myers, correct?" Weiser asked lightly, trying to be as quiet and non-threatening as possible, all the while watching for movement from Karnik's boot. Puzzled by the question, Todd looked the man over before asking, "We served together?" Weiser's mind raced to come up with the right words to say so he would believe him. "I was in the office at Fort Leonard Wood when that asshole took your friend, Master Sergeant. We are here to get her back." Looking around at the men they had just taken down and then back at the one in front of them, Karnik and Todd looked to each other and laughed as Karnik said, "Well, it looks like the six of you are not having much luck with that, young sergeant." Weiser wondered how they could just laugh at killing 5 men who were there to help them. The more he thought about it, the more the rage built up inside him until he couldn't control himself any longer and attempted to attack the man once again in front of him, regardless of who he was. "How dare you laugh at the death of my men!" Weiser screamed as he moved to attack Karnik. It was an attack that ended with a boot to the side of his head, the boot he had tried to avoid earlier. This time it caused the dim light of the forest on a rainy morning to turn black as a moonless night. When Weiser began to awaken, he was instantly surprised not to be dead, and quickly that surprise turned to thoughts of how long he had been out. Everything looked the same, except he was no longer in the same area, but deeper in the woods. "Great! Look who decided to wake up from his boot nap," Todd remarked, seeing Weiser peering around with a surprised look on his face. "What is going on?" Weiser asked, as he began second-guessing whether he was alive or not, while spotting his men standing in front of him. Reaching down, Karnik offered his hand to help Weiser to his feet. "Sorry about the kick to the head, but we needed you to shut up. As you can see, we only rendered your men unconscious, and admittedly a little bruised, but for the most part unharmed." Working his jaw from one side to the other, Weiser took Karnik's hand. With everyone now working together, Karnik's mind began to fill with the many possibilities he now had for an attack. Having hundreds of soldiers present, add less of a challenge than the 6 of them faced alone just a short time ago. After a few minutes of discussion, and not wanting to waste any more time, Karnik began to give orders. "Weiser, have one of your men guide Robert back to where your first sergeant is located. You and your men will move with us into the building. Robert, I trust you to keep us covered. Have all of them focus their fire on the roof and the groups of guards patrolling the grounds. Tell the first sergeant to move in at her discretion after that point. Nobody fires until you do, Robert. I want to get in as close as possible before the first shot. Everyone follow?" Karnik looked to each of them, and seeing there were no other questions, he continued. "We all leave here together. As we have seen, it is going to take some time to move against the current in that stream. Robert, that should give you the time you need to be set and ready. Now let's move," Karnik finished and signaled for the others to follow as he turned to the stream. Kate could feel the anticipation of killing Jonathan growing even stronger inside of her. She really didn't care how she did it, just that she was the person to do so. Moving through the rushing water in the stream, with every step she could feel his presence. Though the water was only knee-high, it seemed to push her back with each step she took forward in an attempt to keep her from advancing. No matter what obstacle presented itself, she had already set it in her mind that nothing was going to prevent her from accomplishing her goal, not even death. Looking around to the others, Kate quickly determined that Karnik would be the one to stay close to, for fear he might kill Jonathan before she could. Overlooking the facility from the rooftop, about 450 yards away from what Robert measured, First Sergeant Thomas asked a little too loudly for the circumstances. "What do you mean? He took my men with him?" Not wanting to agitate her further, Robert replied in a low, soft voice, "Ma'am, there wasn't any time to discuss it without losing the advantage of the morning's low visibility. Karnik felt you would understand." With a little calmer voice, Thomas stated, "First Sergeant, not ma'am. She brought her binoculars up and focused back on the facility. Robert stood there and waited for her to continue. Years in the army told him she was not finished. "Private, inform the others to focus their fire on the rooftop and groups on patrol. I also want 3rd Platoon to make their way to the far side of the facility and do the same. I want that place surrounded. Relay the information." Robert watched the private leave down the ladder as Thomas continued to use the binoculars. Satisfied that everything was in place, he said, "Todd spoke highly of you and was very surprised to hear you were here. Every one of us is thankful that you are." Unpacking full magazines, he placed them along the rooftop for easy access when the fighting started. Thomas pulled back from the binoculars just enough to see what Robert was doing and asked, "Why is it only you 6? I was told you had thousands." Without stopping his preparations, Robert explained quickly how they had just freed people from the FEMA camp, the conditions in which they had found people, and how most of the UCM was now helping those who needed them. When Robert had finished, he could tell Thomas was satisfied by his explanation as she turned quietly back to her surveillance. "It looks like they are nearing the best point to exit the stream," Thomas said, after finding Karnik's and the others' locations in the rushing water. Resting his rifle on a sandbag he had molded to the roof's peak, Robert settled behind his Noreen BN-36 rifle and located the group using its scope. He watched as the line they traveled turned into a tight group, preparing to exit the stream and move to the building. As soon as Robert saw the first person exit, certain it was Karnik, he began scanning the area around them for threats. Robert had hoped they would be able to make it to the buildings before he had to fire, setting off a hailstorm of bullets, but that was not to be the case. After watching the 3rd person exit the stream and turn to help the next person, Robert spotted a soldier on the roof, taking notice and pointing his rifle in the group's direction. Quickly, Robert took aim and fired. Before the bullet had struck, a thunderous roar sounded from hundreds of rifles.